Great, thank you so much. I'll dive right in here with a little bit of background for those of you who may not be familiar with Sage Bionetworks. We're a nonprofit research organization in Seattle, Washington, and we have sort of three main areas in which we conduct our work. And one of those areas is team science. So we play sort of a convening role where we step in and work with groups that are working across institutional boundaries and trying to solve really difficult questions in biomedical research. We also operate in open science, where we run analytical challenges, essentially competitions, where we bring together a solver community of close to 20,000 people who are interested in applying their machine learning and other statistical algorithms to interesting data sets. And then the third area where we operate is in participant-centered science, where we go directly to participants through mobile devices to engage with them in biomedical research. And across all three of those areas, we, as a small nonprofit, we pilot approaches to create open systems, incentives, and norms that can be used across those indications. And then we build infrastructure that provides reusable solutions for the community at large, based on the lessons that we learn, which I'll go over some of them today, and essentially what works and what doesn't in those pilot systems and approaches. And ultimately, the reason we do this is to support research communities that operate under these open principles. And a lot of this work is based around the concept of decentralization. So the process of redistributing or dispersing functions, powers, people, or things away from a central location or authority. And this decentralization has come about largely due to technological advances that no longer mean that biomedical research and other areas are necessarily having to be carried out in a single location. And so why are we seeing this decentralization in biomedical research? Well, some of it is technical, so the pervasiveness of networked information and cloud infrastructure, but some of it is also social, so the democratization of the research process and a push for increased sharing by funders and the public at large. And traditionally, research was conducted within institutions. You had to recruit individuals into a physical location. You generated data based on the participants that you would recruit into a physical location, and because the data resided there, all of the analysis was done at that location. And so we saw a proliferation of these institutional silos, but with technological advances as well as social advances, we can start to rethink the way that we conduct research and start to break apart both those institutional silos as well as the functional areas that constitute biomedical research. So you can start to break apart recruitment and data generation and data analysis into distinct parts that may not necessarily have to occur within a single organization or within a single institution. And while technology helps enable that, this is a little bit more about the way we operate at Sage. So I mentioned the fact that we try and pilot open incentives, systems, and norms, but we use open as a guiding principle and try not to be dogmatic about it, realizing that there are times when open is very important, and there are other times where it may actually be a hindrance to what we're trying to accomplish. And similarly, we think the cloud provides a very powerful tool, especially in this decentralized world. And so we use it as sort of our native solution. We build technologies that are based in the cloud, but we also realize that we're in a period of transition, so we try not to force that solution on others. I just want to take a moment and say that, you know, in our experience, technology is important and it enables a lot of this change, but it's not enough. And so we really focus sort of at the intersection of three areas: the principles that we think are important, people, and then the technology or the platforms that we provide. And so, you know, the principles can be, you know, open as a principle. It can be some of the principles that we employ during our dream challenges, and we provide platforms. So on the mobile side, Bridge, and on the data sharing and collaborative science side, Synapse. But importantly, it's important to embed people and actual relationships as part of this decentralized model, if things are actually going to operate smoothly. And so this is really ultimately about community building. We call our collaborative research groups communities because really it is not just about you know, conducting science, but it's really building relationships and norms that help do science in a more efficient way. And so, you know, I mentioned that we pilot a lot of different ideas and solutions, and you know, part of what I want to do in this talk is to share some of the success stories and things that have worked, but also talk about cases where things have not worked very well. And I think it's important to share sort of both of those sides of the coin. And so I'm going to share just a handful of sort of anecdotes and talk through our experiences and why we think they're important for the larger research community. So the first one is sort of in the vein of open and not being too dogmatic about it. We've found that sharing for the sake of sharing is necessary. Sharing is necessary, but it's not necessarily sufficient to get true value out of shared data sets, nor out of decentralized research. So the first example I'm going to give, excuse me, is one of the analytical challenges that we ran in 2015 with a group called Project Datasphere. So Project Datasphere is an independent nonprofit that spun out of the CEO roundtable of the pharmaceutical industry. And what Project Datasphere has done is it has amassed a large amount of comparator arm data from clinical trials that have been run not just by pharma, but also by academic groups. And the idea is that while pharmaceutical industry may not have been very excited about sharing the clinical trial data from their new compounds, the large phase 3 trials that are carried out also have comparator arms that have essentially the current best in class that they're trying to compare their new drugs or their new treatments against. And so Project Datasphere has amassed almost 100,000 patients from a number of different clinical trials, mostly in oncology. And there are some stats there on the left about the data sets that they have amassed and the number of downloads, users, et cetera, et cetera. But part of what they were finding is that without a sort of central question that is being asked, that the data are well poised to answer. Until you do that, the true value of these data aren't necessarily realized. And so we worked with them to design a challenge in castrate-resistant prostate cancer, where we had 3 trials that were used for training data that included about 1,600 patients, and then had held out validation data from a 4th trial that was used to assess the predictions that were made by the challenge community. And what the challenge community was trying to optimize for was predicting survival of individuals over time, and doing that based strictly on the clinical data that was gathered as part of the trial. And so, the sort of challenge paradigm is that, you have your training data, you have your held out validation data, and this is important because it allows for systematic sampling of a space of diverse methods, while still providing an unbiased, consistent, and rigorous assessment of those methods. And essentially what we saw as the output of this challenge was that there was, in fact, a prediction algorithm that had been developed by an academic group, a very, very good researcher. And if you can see here, I hope you can see my cursor, the pink box represents the integrated area under the curve for that model as it was deployed in these data sets. And you can see it fell in the bottom half of the tested algorithms, and was outperformed by a good number of them. And this is, I think, an important point. It's not that this individual necessarily had a bad model or something that wasn't good. This is a model that had been developed into a web tool that physicians were actually using to calculate risk. But the important thing to realize here is that by opening up a set of data and a specific problem based around those data, we're able to better optimize on the outputs that are seen and the insights that are seen from that. And so again, that anecdote was really, sharing is great and it's important to make data available, but when it becomes really powerful is when you coordinate a group of people around a problem. The second point I'm going to make here is be mindful of when open is appropriate, because occasionally there can be unintended consequences. So this example is another challenge that we ran. This is actually the first challenge that we ran back in 2013. And this was sort of similar to the previous example that I gave, in that participants were trying to predict overall survival as well. But in this case, they're trying to predict it in a cohort of breast cancer patients. And they were trying to do it based on gene expression data that was generated across about 2,000 individuals. And so we had an interesting challenge question, a very interesting data set. And part of what we were trying to foster as part of this first challenge was a little bit more of a collaborative effort, sort of embedded in the challenge infrastructure. And so this is sort of a busy slide describing how the actual challenge was carried out, but I want to highlight one area in particular, which is that about a month into the challenge, we decided that it was a very good idea to encourage code sharing. And so we had a live leaderboard that people were optimizing their algorithms for. And towards the end of phase one, we said, you know what? We'd like to see some sort of cross-pollination across groups here. And we think that it's important to try and learn from the other analytical methods. So anybody who uses some part of another group's code and or algorithm as part of their solution, that then sort of dethrones the current leader, we'll give a cash prize. We'll give, I want to say it was about $1,000, something like that, which we thought was a really good idea, would, sort of bring the community together, try and learn from one another. But actually what we saw was that people started trying to optimize only on the best predicting algorithm. And so instead of taking their own algorithm and building an ensemble of models, for instance, or taking some clever data curation bit from one group and using it, instead what the majority of people started doing was making small tweaks to the leader's algorithm such that they could win this cash prize. And I mentioned one of the important things about these analytical challenges is that it provides a diverse set, an assessment of a diverse set of analytical approaches. And by encouraging this code sharing early on, what we did is we sort of narrowed the space, that unintentionally narrowed the space of the methods that were being assessed. And so you can see the metrics on the lower left. You can see a plateau that happens. That plateau coincides with when we tried to optimize for code sharing. And now we don't know if that is causal. We don't know if that is in fact the reason that we saw that plateau. It may be that that really is sort of the upper bound of what was likely to be solved. But we do know that we limited the space of methods that were being assessed. The next anecdote that I want to get to is identify your end goal and then align incentives for the groups that you're trying to engage with to get you to that end goal. And so in this case, I have probably used this example in other talks that I've given to this group, but I think it's a powerful one. There was a series of papers that came out in 2014, all claiming to have the molecular subtypes of colon cancer based on gene expression data. These were all really, really good researchers doing very good work, very similar to the person who developed the algorithm in prostate cancer, castrate-resistant prostate cancer. But what the community saw in these 4 papers was in fact an inconsistency. So one of these groups said that there were 6 subtypes. 2 of these groups said there were 4. One of them said there were 3. And each one of the groups had slightly different prevalences, and each one of the groups had slightly different underlying biological mechanisms that were represented as part of the subtypes. And so the community, the colorectal cancer research community, in particular, the physicians who were treating these patients, didn't know where to take it, didn't know how to take this information and take it forward. And so we knew that we needed to get to some sort of consensus and or resolve this. And so we reached out to each one of these 4 groups, as well as 2 others that we knew that were working in the space. And instead of sort of the traditional model where each team is running their subtyping algorithm on their data set and determining a subtype, we instead brought all these groups together, curated all of the data, as well as some additional data that was in the public domain, for instance, from TCGA, and had each one of the teams run their subtyping algorithms on each one of the data sets. So at this point, we have a factorial design where each one of the teams is running their algorithms on each one of the data sets. We can start to tease apart why we were seeing those differences in the subtypes. So was it due to analytical methods? Was it due to technical differences between the way the data were generated? Was it due to actual subsampling of the colorectal cancer space? And at the end of the day, what we ended up finding is that generally these groups actually agreed with one another. It didn't necessarily matter what algorithm you were using to generate the subtypes. The differences were being seen because each one of these groups only had a small set of samples that they were looking at. And so until they had access to these additional data sets, there was no way to sort of drive consensus as far as what was being seen. And so there ended up being general agreement that there were 4 what we now call consensus molecular subtypes that have very, very strong biological underpinnings. And in fact, the results of these now, in particular, one of them, the CMS1 MSI immune group, is being used it's being used to subselect participants in clinical trials in Europe. And so we had to take the end game where we knew we had to get to and align the incentives of the individual groups in order to help us get to this final stage. And then the last sort of anecdote that I'm going to hit on here is to go directly to the participants. So I mentioned earlier on that we are working in the space of mobile health, where we are going, where instead of having an individual come into a physical location where they will take part in a trial or a study, instead we're taking the trial to them, and we're doing that through a mobile application where participants can consent and complete activities right on their mobile phones. And so the study that I'm going to focus on here is in Parkinson's disease. It's called mPower. It was launched in March of 2015, so it's been ongoing for a little over 2 years. But I'm actually not going to focus on the actual quote unquote science, the types of measures that we're able to gather. And instead, I'm going to focus on some of the feedback that we've gotten from the participants, and really to remember that at the end of the day, even if it seems like it's far removed from a patient or a participant, ultimately we're doing this research to help individuals. And so this is from our website. And again, to remember that there are actual individuals behind these data points that we're looking at. And my colleague Meg Dorr published a paper on some of the unstructured responses that we got, some of the feedback that we got from this paper in JMIR M Health earlier this year. And I want to hit on a number of these pieces of feedback that we got from participants, because I think it's really powerful to realize what their experience is like in participating in one of these trials. And so we hear things like, I feel like I'm helping to reach an overall outcome, so very positive. Another participant said, I don't have Parkinson's, but I'm happy to participate in the study if it helps to find help for those who do have it. So again, very, very positive. And so, we ask participants to do tasks like put the phone in your pocket and take about 20 steps in a straight line and listen to your phone for audio instructions. And by doing this, we can assess gait and balance using the accelerometer on the phone. We also have spatial memory tests, and participants would give feedback on this. So they actually have insights into the way that the data is being collected. So one participant said, you should ask if the pants or shorts are tight or not, because I had my phone in loose pants and the range for gait was very small, but in tight pants, it was very big. And so this is somebody who was actually realizing that their phone was moving differently in their pants based on the way that the type of pants or shorts that they were using. Another participant said, the time of day affects my performance irregardless of medication. They were noticing that their memory was better in the morning after coffee. Another participant said it's not good to do memory activity at night after wine. And I actually have a confession to make. This one was actually myself. So this was me and my colleague Meg Dorr enjoying a glass of wine on my deck. One of the other things that we saw is that there was a steep drop-off in participation. So we had a large number of people who would enroll in the study, but over time it was very difficult to get them to come back and to continue to participate. So some people said, doing this is a lot of work. You should send us an email now and then to let us know how it's going. Another person said, if you depend on us to partner with you in research, it would be good to give us feedback. Could you provide summary trend reports in plain language? So again, interesting feedback from participants who are wanting to get something back out of the research as well. And this is not traditionally the way that research has been done. But I think going forward, it's going to be continually important to figure out ways to treat participants as partners in the research process as much as you can. And so we listened and we provided both in-app as well as email summary statistics of the types of people who were contributing. We also held a anonymous webinar where anybody could log in and hear early results that were coming from the study, as well as to express our gratitude for the people who were participating. And coming off of that, people had suggestions for how best to keep people engaged. So one suggestion is an incentive program and incorporate tangible goals and visual rewards either through points or badges. You could establish goals for members so they can accomplish each task in a certain time for bonus rewards. Somebody else said it would probably mess up your double-blind nature or privacy, but it is my experience that those of us with Parkinson's will often show up and be more consistent when we are involved in a group rather than as individuals because of our inherent lethargy and apathy. So again, really insightful feedback. Somebody else said, make everything a game, make it interactive and fun. Even though kids are the ones supposed to be playing games to learn, it makes it easier for adults too. It would make it fun and makes me want to come back to finish the task every day. And so there's sort of this inherent tension between, conducting a research study that is focused on collecting very specific types of data to quantify symptoms and or experiences, but also making it something that a participant wants to come back to day after day. And that's because when you're running app-based mobile health studies, you're not competing with other research studies necessarily. You're not competing with, other things that somebody may be doing at a doctor's office. You're competing with other apps that people are using on their phone. You're competing with Pokemon Go. You're competing with Facebook app. And if you think about it, at least for me, how many apps does an individual use on a daily basis? And for me, it's probably a small number. It's probably 4 or 5. And so how do you make an application, a research application that people want to come back to time and again? And I'm going to end with a series of quotes that are actually can be difficult to read, but I think are important to realize the experiences that some of these people are going through. So one person said, the memory question gets hard very quickly, and this is hard on the ego. Somebody else said, I just feel that if I forget to complete the study activities, it's going to make me feel even worse that I have Parkinson's. Somebody else said, I'm going to quit this program. I don't like going through all those symptoms that I don't have yet. I don't want to think about what may be coming. And so this was very humbling for us to realize, and has really made us rethink the way that we will be designing the 2.0 version of the Empower study, which we're hoping to launch next year. And it also comes back to the mobile consent, and that we make a lot of these, we try and make these things clear up front, that in this case, there are issues to consider. Participating in this study could generate a wide range of emotions, may make you feel tired, sad, energized, or happy. And you can see by the responses, for some people, it hit a wide range of those emotions. But really remembering that the data that you're collecting as part of these studies really has a human aspect behind it. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up and happy to take any questions.
I'll start. This is Andrew. Thanks again, Brian. Another nice, real interesting presentation. I have two questions. So first, on the last, on the Empower study, right? I think I probably have asked this in a number of different ways, but I'm continually struck by the engagement challenges, right? The spike of additional enrollments and trying to keep people engaged. You mentioned several metrics. Feedback was one important one. Gamification, the webinars. So, I guess, do you have any sense as to, is there one dominant thing that you guys are really focusing on in Empower 2 just to address that issue of engagement?
Yeah, so a really good question. We are continually with each of the new applications that we're developing. So we have launched a couple recently, one in multiple sclerosis and one in chronic anemia. And for each one of the new studies that we're rolling out, we're taking a very purposeful design approach up front, where we have a set of interviews with people who would be in the study population, to try and understand what they would and would not be willing to do. And so it's sort of this balance between what you as a researcher need to be able to collect in order to adequately power your study, for instance, and what participants are actually going to be willing to do. And so we don't yet have necessarily like hard evidence saying that this is a quote unquote better way to engage participants, but we have learned a lot in that process. And I can say that it's not a universal thing that goes across studies. It's very specific to the cohort of individuals that you're trying to engage with. I will say, I'll give two additional points. One is that I think gamification is going to be really hard, because you're going to be, if you gamify things too much, you're going to be competing with apps that are, their sole purpose is to be a game. And I think if you have the funds and the time to develop something that is really engaging, that it may be possible that would work. But we have tried it in small pieces, awarding badges, awarding points, that sort of thing. And it hasn't worked very well for us. But I do think the majority of the feedback that we get is that people just want some sort of feedback. They want some sort of information about how they as an individual are doing. And so people are used to mobile health apps being about the individual, and providing value to the individual around how they have been doing recently. Think about any of the, your Fitbit or your Apple Watch, your activity trackers. And so if you can find a way to provide useful information back to somebody such that it can help them manage their disease, I think that is an area that could really have a lasting impact.
Cool, that's great. A lot of great information. I'll defer to anybody else who has any questions.